Our organization is dedicated to promoting pluralism and advocating for civil and human rights through education, advocacy, and cultural initiatives. And today we're so excited to be discussing Vaishnavi's second book, Goddess of the River. I have my coffee right over here. It Vaishnavi is a New York Times bestselling author for her debut novel Kaikeyi, and also a distinguished civil rights and constitutional law attorney. And she graciously served as one of our judges for our civil rights and essay contest last year. I first encountered her work through Kaikeyi, and when Goddess of the River released, I was so excited to get my hands on it. This story is a retelling of the Mahabharata from a unique perspective of the river goddess Ganga. So, you wonderful audience, I hope you're excited to listen to me fangirl for basically an hour. And we will have some time in the second half for questions, so feel free to pop questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many as possible. And then I'd love to just start with Vaishnavi, your journey into Hindu mythology, because one of my favorite quotes about these stories comes from A.K. Ramanujan's essay, The 300 Ramayanas, where he talks about how, like, no one reads the Ramayana or the Mahabharata for the first time, and how these stories are always already. And that was, for me, those entry points were like my family and grandparents and these Gardy Tales CDs that my parents would play in the car. And notably for me, Amar Chitrakarta comics, which has been my like most recent understanding into like media portrayals of like caste, color, and Hindu nationalism. So I'd love to hear like what were your relationships to these stories and Hindu mythology when you were younger?
Yeah, so I think similarly to you, I grew up hearing these stories primarily from my grandmother on my mom's side. She would come stay with us every summer to basically help out and watch us because both my parents worked. And at lunchtime, she would kind of bribe us to come and sit down quickly and eat our lunch by promising to tell us stories, me and my younger sister. And so we would get to hear stories every single day from her, from various mythologies. And when I look back on it, I think we did hear the Ramayana in approximate order over the course of a summer. We heard the Mahabharat in approximate order over the course of a summer, but there were also random stories sprinkled in. We would randomly hear about like one piece of the epic, and then later we would understand its context. So it was kind of these like small chunks of oral tradition being passed down to us over time. And I think that is a common experience to hear those stories from your grandparents or from your parents. But a lot of us come to this story orally. And I think that's a marker of the way that this religion is practiced, is that most people didn't have access to reading the written scriptures and the written epics. They were hearing it orally and transmitting it orally. And I think that's a really powerful form of transmission. I also watched the weird little serials, like Chota Bheem. Have I made this up or is this like a real thing? I watched like the adventures of baby Hanuman. I had the Amar Chitra Kathas. I also had this like, eventually I got this very odd illustrated Ramayana, but it was just like the pictures had no connection to the text. Like you come to it in a variety of ways. I did not read Valmiki's Ramayana translation until I was maybe 22. So this has been percolating in my mind for a long time. I was a Kathak dancer, so I was literally dancing these stories, and I'd never once actually read the definitive text. And I think we're going to get into that, but I don't necessarily think that that means that you're not part of the epic and part of the tradition. So yeah, it's hard to say when I first got to the epics because they've just been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. The only fun fact is that for the Mahabharat, I took a world literature class in college. It was part of the required core curriculum at my undergraduate school. And my professor was a white man, but he was a translator. So he'd been doing like Sanskrit to English translation. So even though most other classes didn't read it, we read parts of the Mahabharata. So I actually got the experience of reading that in an academic setting. But it was like very upsetting to me because my classmates did not take it seriously and thought it was very funny. And they called Krishna Chris, which is like, I guess, something you can do, but then it became like a very like funny colloquial thing for them. And I was like, okay, when we're reading like the Epic of Gilgamesh, you know, people are not believing in these gods right now, but you literally have a classmate sitting here who is Hindu, and this is all just like a joke. So that was kind of like a bad experience, exposure to the Mahabharata. But you know, who hasn't dealt with a microaggression or two?
No, that's such a crazy way to like learn about your culture in an academic setting, especially because there's not a lot of times where you get to, period. And so the fact that that was your entryway into it is, I
Yeah.
feel like definitely unfortunate, but also like a bit unsurprising.
No, it
Unfortunate.
was like, and our professor was great, and he was always trying to like rein it in and be like, he would never call them by nicknames. He was like, this is a very serious, like interesting text. But my classmates were just, I think, so turned off by the names that they couldn't get into it, which is like, the names are bad. I mean, it's like bad in the sense of like there's a million of them to memorize, but like they're not any, you know, more difficult than like Daenerys Targaryen, and like
Yeah.
here we are. So.
I mean, yeah, you mentioned like the crazy cast, and I kind of want to talk a little bit more about that because like of the stories to try to tell, the Mahabharata is a huge endeavor, right? There's
I
so many,
literally have my like abridged Mahabharat that I've been referring. This is the abridged version,
right? Yeah, it's like
the
yeah, the abridged
shortened,
versions are like
simplified version.
600 pages or
Yeah.
something ridiculous like that. And like you manage to, in a relatively compact way, like weave together all the different stories and like build a lot of space for like Ganga's character to flourish and like be able to have agency in the story, and she feels very alive in every aspect of the book. And so like how did you even begin that process to write a story like this, and where do you begin?
Yeah, so I think that it was a tough endeavor to try to figure out how to condense it, because the family tree itself like takes 2 pages. um, and when I first write my book, I write with my sister in mind. So essentially, I use her as a stand-in for somebody who's culturally familiar with the stories. I don't need to sit here and explain to her why the Pandavas and the Kauravas are fighting, right? But then when you go back in, you also have to make the text accessible to people who might not have that context. And so I think for me, it was really about focusing on Ganga and Bhishma as the two POV characters and focusing on their stories and their arcs, and then bringing other people in organically as benefited the character arcs and journeys of these two principal characters. And so you don't get the development of Yudhishthir that you might get when you actually read the Mahabharata, but that's because there's role in the story is as one of Bhishma's grandsons or grandnephews, not really as Bhishma's like not really as his own character who is fighting to become king. And I think contextualizing the stories into the points of view of the main characters was really how I tackled that, because otherwise it would just be an overwhelming project. And at that point, you can read the Mahabharata. You can read many of the translations, abridged versions of the Mahabharata. You can go watch a Mahabharata serial. Like, I think part of the fun of, for me, of writing retellings is excavating parts of the story that you're not getting. And so trying to focus on that and just bring in the rest of the story as it comes was the most helpful. I'm not sure 100% that I succeeded in making this like accessible for people who have no idea what the Mahabharata is. Like I'm sure that on first read it is extremely confusing, but I got to tell the story that I wanted to tell for the people I wanted to tell it to, which has always primarily been other South Asian and Hindu readers.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I would agree with you a little bit just because I think the Mahabharata, unless you take each story apart,
Yeah.
it's really hard to like tell as a whole, right? Because there's so many different parts, there's so many small stories. Like I was thinking about like Ekalavya as like one of the
Yes.
little vignettes that we get to experience in your book. And like that's a story separate from the Mahabharata that I've heard before, and I've heard it as a part of it, um
Right.
but you get to experience everything together in a very unique way, and you get to kind of pull all of those stories together.
Yeah, there's this saying that my mom always says, but she says she didn't originate it. I don't know who did, which is like if there's not a story in the world that's not in the Mahabharata. And because like the Mahabharata literally has the Ramayana in it. And I think more to her point, it's like every theme or idea or conflict that you could imagine, you'll probably find it in the Mahabharata because that's just how expansive it is. It has like holy books in it, it has the Ramayana in it, it has like an entire tangent that takes place with none of the characters and like very little relate. It's like you're in a story within a story, and then you start getting a third tier story within a story. So you have to kind of narrow your focus, and I think that's part of going back to the oral tradition piece. The Mahabharata to me, more than the Ramayana, feels like an oral tradition piece when you try to read it because it's like you are just getting like, oh, the storyteller wants to talk about this other story and the storyteller wants to talk about this other story. And that's the setup of the Mahabharata, right? It's like it is being told to Dhritarashtra by the sage as by Vyas as it's happening. So like that is kind of how you get that feeling.
Yeah, and like I think about it in terms of like a lot of like the way people consider female storytelling, where when people talk to each other colloquially, they're like, "Oh, I especially women will start talking about a story and then they'll jump into something else and be like, actually, I need to give you context about something else. Actually, I need to tell you this other story." And that's how this feels, is like you're like, oh, I'm getting context about like 15 other things right now. But I promise it'll
Yeah,
all make sense once you get to the
exactly.
end.
And when you're hearing it orally over the course, I think something that we forget about oral tradition sometimes when we just talk about it as like a general academic concept as opposed to how it's actually practiced is that it's not somebody getting up on a stage and reciting. It's somebody sitting down at the dinner table and telling you the story, and then you go, Ajji, what, I don't remember who this character is. Why did this character do this thing? Wait, is this the same character who did this thing 5 stories ago? Like it's a interactive process where you are talking to the storyteller, asking questions, getting responses, asking about things you're curious about, trying to make connections. Like you are getting that back and forth. That's what makes it so rich. And so a story like the Mahabharata is kind of ripe for going, wait, is this the same guy who was there 100 pages ago? And if it's in the oral tradition, you're able to get that interaction with the expert storyteller.
Yeah, absolutely. And we touched on it, but I want to go back to the part about um some of the other mythology traditions that are pretty commonly read and talked about, and how like there is a very like strong cultural appeal, especially in the West, to like mythology retellings like Song of Achilles, and a lot of these other books have gotten a lot of like very mainstream and like viral success, right? Um, and like in India, I would say like mythology retellings are ubiquitous, right? Like every TV show, every other TV show, every even the children's series, like you mentioned, Chota Bheem has like integrated a lot of these stories into them, even if that's not their like exact focus on a like episode to episode basis. Um, but how do you how do you think about like looking at something like Hindu mythology, which you're telling in more of a Western context, um, where it's still a pretty widely practiced religion and it's very culturally significant? Like, what are the similarities and differences in your approach to something that is like, I think, a lot closer and more personal, and I guess even the term mythology to describe it is considered a bit like, I mean, I think some people would take offense to the term mythology to be
Definitely.
describing it as well.
I think it's a complicated question. I think there's multiple parts to it. So speaking first to the broad trend, I think last year, maybe 2 years ago, I counted like 25 to 30 Greek myth retellings that had come out, and every single one of them was by a white woman. And I think that is like inextricably bound up. Like here in the West, white women are the most successful in publishing because that's who publishing wants to like elevate and put money behind. I think there's a certain group of people that feels that Greek mythology is their heritage of the West, whether or not it actually is. Like many Greek people feel very differently about that question. But because they've, read the Odyssey in high school, they feel like it's theirs. And I think in many ways, the Greek mythology and mythos and epics have become canonized as part of this like created Western past that doesn't really actually exist, but like has kind of like the Greeks to the Romans to the British to the US, like that's not a real line, but we pretend that it is. And so I think that's part of why that's so popular is that people feel like it's their shared past. But I think that there's a lot of value in retelling stories outside of, Greek, Roman, and Norse. And I'm excited that there have been a few more stories in that space recently, but there's not a lot. And I think that's because people don't feel like these epics are their cultural past, and so they don't feel like it has any relevance to them, even though I would argue that it almost has more relevance because it is a religion that's practiced by a billion people today. So, unlike Greek mythology, which is not really an actively practiced widespread religion at this point, when we're talking about the Hindu epics, they are widely believed in and respected and looked to for cultural lessons and contexts. I think that makes writing these epics, retellings, kind of a balancing on a knife's edge because on the one hand, it's my religion and culture and history, and I feel like I should be able to write about this like shared cultural past of my people. But on the other hand, plenty of people are really mad about any attempt to retell or reclaim any of these stories, especially from a feminist perspective. And I think just because it's so widely practiced, you get so many reactions. And I think we're going to talk about this a bit later, but I kind of try to keep two things in mind. One is that there are a million, literally a million versions of these stories. Every person has their own, like a family canon of these stories. And so I feel somewhat comfortable playing in these worlds and changing details because I know that many, many people have done that before me. And that is the beauty of these stories is that they accommodate such change. And that's, to me, the beauty of Hinduism is that it can accommodate so many different actual practices, belief systems, philosophies. It's a very accommodating and expansive religion at its best. And so, I kind of take that as my inspiration. And on the other hand, I just accept that some people are not going to be happy. And my job isn't to make readers happy. My job is to present questions and ideas that I think are important and bring those into conversation with other people.
Yeah, so talking a little bit more about the reception part of it, like, does that of like I'm sure you're constantly thinking about it as you're writing because it's such a critical part of like the journey, but like do you consider it when you're kind of putting together a story, or like how does it factor into your writing process?
The potential for backlash.
Like the potential for backlash, the wide practice of the religion, like these things where people hold it so close and so dear.
Yeah. I think I don't try to let fear of backlash affect me. I don't want to write a book that I'm trying to write to get the least backlash possible. What I do, and this is both out of respect for other people, but also out of respect for myself and my religion, is that whenever I make a change, I always make sure I know why I'm making that change. So I want to be conscious of the changes I'm making, and I want there to be a rationale for the changes I'm making. And a good example of this is in Goddess of the River. This is not really a spoiler because it's in part one. In Goddess of the River, I have Krishna come down to earth much earlier in the narrative than he does in the actual Mahabharat. That's a change, but I knew I was making that change. And the reason I made that change is because Ganga's journey needs gods to play off of. And Krishna is one very critical perspective on what a god should do in the Mahabharata itself. And Shiva is providing the other example. And so I needed Krishna to come down and be that other emotional, resonance point in the story. So there was an emotional arc part and there was a philosophical arc part, and that's why I bring him in early. So even though I know I've changed the story, I have a reason for it. And making sure that every single change, there is a reason. It's not just by accident or by carelessness, and the reason is more important than preserving the original story, I think helps me make sure that I'm writing a story that I can stand behind and be proud of.
Absolutely. And I mean, we're talking about like all of these stories and the way that it's different, but there's also a lot of emphasis and impact on particular stories, right? Like certain perspectives in Hinduism have become canonized, right? Despite the religiously diverse forms of the religion. And so like how does that impact like your writing, and like maybe even like broader, how does it impact like the religion itself and the way that we view it?
I think I just spoke about how I think that one of the beautiful things about Hinduism is that it is so pluralistic, and that it can accommodate so many different beliefs and ways of practicing and versions of the story within its umbrella. I think that that is one of the things that sets it apart from almost all of the uh, other religious traditions that are like widely practiced today. And I think that makes it scary in some ways to be Hindu, because uh, there are these other very, very streamlined versions of religions that are out there. And I think that some amount, I don't want to attribute like any, negative intentions to the original kind of attempts to very much mainstream certain stories in certain ways, because I think that would be a natural human response to feeling like your religion is kind of being singled out among for not be having a consistent story. I think it kind of makes sense that as we have the internet and book publishing and things like that, you also get the dissemination of a particular version of the story. On the other hand, I think that we are canonizing versions of the story often that are more conservative. And I don't mean in the political sense, I mean in the, more broader cultural sense, versions of the story. And that to me is a bit frightening, because an example that I will take from Kaikeyi is that I got so many people who were very mad at me that plenty of people mad at me for plenty of things, but one of the things that made me laugh is that people were mad that I had Kaikeyi's bride price from Dashrath be that her child would sit on the throne, because that gives her a justification for everything that she does in the book and in the epic. And they were like, this never happened. Like, this is just like feminism gone crazy. That is an actual line from the Valmiki Ramayana. It just is. Like that's a fact. And so people were getting mad at me because they knew like the mainstream version of the story that did not involve this detail, because that detail just got omitted by being an unimportant part of an unimportant character. And yet, actually, it's like giving color and justification to one of the female characters. So it is, in my opinion, actually extremely important. And that's just one small example. So I think, we see a more upper class, upper caste, patriarchal version often get enshrined when it has never been that way, in my opinion. Like, sure, there was the Sanskrit written version, but everybody got to have their own versions that were relevant to their histories and their stories and their traditions. And in erasing that, we're losing a lot of what makes Hinduism beautiful.
Yeah, and
That's just like my personal hot take, though. You're free to disagree. Tell me in the Q&A. That's fine.
no, I think it's just really interesting that like there's so many oppositions to having diverse versions of the story when like abridged versions are versions,
Yeah.
right? And like I don't know too many people that are reading the original Ramayana or the original Mahabharata. Like most people are reading a version of it if they're reading it on paper. So it's really interesting that like
And let's be real, most people can't read Sanskrit. So, like, you're reading a translation, and translators make choices. When I was writing and doing my research process for critical passages, I often consulted multiple translations because I was like, something is going to go, something is going to be different or contextually different based on how the editor is viewing it. But, like, most Indians do not speak Sanskrit. Like my mom studied it because she was a nerd in the way that like nerds here study Latin. It's me, I'm the nerd. Um, but like most people are not reading the original, true original epic. So we're all reading versions in a way.
and we're all remembering versions too.
Exactly.
Um yeah, so especially if we get more into the like political context of the point at which you're engaging with these myths. I mean, one of the things that we've been dancing around is the reception. And we've been talking about it a little bit, but I want to dive a little more into that is like how has a lot of the reception, especially in the current Indian political context and the rise of Hindu nationalism worldwide and particularly in India and the US, how has that like affected the way that your work's been received and some of the ways that you've had to navigate this political moment as you're writing
Yes.
these beautiful books?
Uh, so there's like three ways I would say. There's the ridiculous, which is like I get comments all the time that are like a bit less now, but in the first year and a half after Kaikeyi came out, like all the time, that were like, how dare you portray Hinduism as a patriarchal religion? And I was just like, I'm happy for you that you've never experienced patriarchy within Hinduism, but like me personally, I guess I'm just different. But my, I think that was just like a ridiculous comment because it's like every time I do an event, and I'll say it here, even though I think my audience already knows this intimately, every single major religion has a patriarchy problem. I live in Texas right now. I am dealing with a Christian patriarchy problem every day of my life. That doesn't make Hinduism exempt, and that doesn't make the epics exempt. And funnily enough, most of those comments were from men. And almost every woman I talk to says to me, like, the Ramayana, the Sita's exile at the end really bothered me as a woman. So it's like even in the epics, women are picking up on some of these things. So I found those responses silly. Then I get the you're secretly like you hate Hindus and you're writing your books to oppress Hindus, which is, you know, a fun thing to hear as a Hindu woman who is like trying to, in her day job, fight Christian nationalism. Because I wrote my books for primarily when I was first thinking about them, I was writing them for other Hindu women. But also, they've been so many people's entry point into learning about Hinduism as a religion and like learning about its existence for some people. And I don't think any of them have walked away from it with a negative impression of Hinduism, because people understand what retellings are and what the project of retellings is. Um, so I think that's really funny because I wrote it to teach more people about Hinduism in a way. And then there's been the official response from India, which is not official in the sense of like the Indian government, but official in the sense of like Indian lawyers, which is that Kaikeyi was supposed to come out in 2022 in India. And a week prior to release, the publication was canceled because an independent group of lawyers had determined that it violated the religious offense laws in India. So the way it kind of works is that there's religious offense laws in India that make it a crime to publish any material that could cause offense to any member of a particular religion. The way it's worded means that literally any person can walk into a police station and be like, I am offended by this media, as a Hindu, as a Muslim, etc. And it makes publishers very wary. And so there's these kind of independent lawyers whose job it is to tell publishers that this book is maybe risky. And they put red flags all over Kaikeyi. So the publication was canceled, the contract was canceled. No other publisher has been willing to pick it up. And that has been tough because I would have really loved for it to come out in India, and I don't think it's offensive. Goddess of the River, I like just this week learned is going to be coming out. The lawyers have finally cleared it, so that's very exciting. There were months of back and forth about some of the different passages. But I kind of just wrote them a lot of essays about the like actual epic, like lines in the epic that were just as offensive, and then they finally gave in. So I'm not going to really believe it until it's actually like out in India, but I think Goddess of the River will come out, which will be very exciting. I think I just want to say though on that, there are as many negative comments that I've gotten. There have been 10 times as many positive comments from Hindu people. So I don't want to be painting with a broad brush, because I think most Hindu people who come to this work are really excited to just see a different perspective and to get to read about the epics that they love in this other context. They're not mad, they're not particularly offended by it. They see it for what it is, which is a feminist reclamation of some of these stories, interesting what if examination, taking some of these themes and, as you know, somebody living in the 2020s, re-examining those themes with that sort of lens. And so I really don't want to act like it's been everybody, because most of it has been wonderful. And that's why I want to keep writing, is because I get so many people who say that they feel represented. And that's really what I wanted to do.
Yeah, no, and there are so many excited people here, so I'm gonna ask some of the questions that we've been getting. One of the ones that I wanted to ask was talking about caste. They asked, how does caste figure in a more feminist retelling of the Mahabharata? And I'm really curious how you took questions of things that are more generally and specifically to caste as well, in terms of um like a lot of sexism that you see in particular stories, a lot of casteism that you see in a lot of stories, and predominantly throughout a lot of these stories. um how do you figure out how to navigate those or show them in a way that doesn't depict them as positive, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so when I wrote Kaikeyi, I joked like I can fit everything in there, but I can't fit like a true castism take because you have some amount of like discussion of what happens when you concentrate religious power in the hands of a few at the top, but you couldn't really get into it. I think that it would be impossible to write a Mahabharata retelling without talking about caste. And so I wasn't going to try. Like, I didn't want to erase that. I wanted to dive into it. And so I think the way I approach that is that it's Goddess of the River is a feminist retelling in the sense of it's told through a female perspective and from a female lens. It's not like blatantly feminist in the way Kaikeyi is about reclaiming female power. And what that allowed me to do is to open up the lens a little bit and have other perspectives in the story that can bring in conversation about caste. So you have Ekalavya, who is forced to, I don't want to necessarily give spoilers, although I think everyone knows what happens, but what happens to him happens because he's considered to be like tribal and not within the caste system, and so he's kicked out and then mutilated. You have Vidur, who is probably the only truly morally good person in the book, like the only morally untouched person who would never have been able to take the throne because his mother is Shudra. You have Garna, who should get the throne, except that he's mistreated his whole life because he is not Kshatriya, and his actual brothers treat him terribly because they don't know that. And in my opinion, that is actually a lesson about like the dangers of caste prejudice. But also, I think in the Mahabharata, to me, it's a kind of difficult take to swallow because at the end you're told, well, they shouldn't have treated him like that because actually he was Kshatriya by birth. And really, for me, the takeaway is they shouldn't have treated him like that because you shouldn't treat people like that. But I think that's an easy reframing that you can do when you're telling your version of the story, to kind of be like, not that these people shouldn't have been treated this way because, oh, they were like particularly special or amazing, but they shouldn't have been treated that way because that's a bad way to run your society. And so I think because the Mahabharata is so caste conscious as an epic in that every character's caste matters, it was kind of natural to bring in discussions of caste into the book.
Absolutely. And Shanti is asking, it seems like as there are many voices and storytellers allowed into the public sphere in India and the diaspora, such female Harikatha exponents like Vishaka Hari, it feels like there's less space to be critical or disruptive now compared to what we know happened historically. How do we bring back that love of diverse ways of seeing and understanding that Hinduism was supposedly famous for?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an easy answer to that because I think that's the whole question is that I feel that that's what makes Hinduism special and unique, but it's not easy to convince other people of that. I think that there is a political component to this, which is that when you have any nationalist government, and I will speak about the US, because I think it's an easier example because people maybe feel less defensive about that right now, is that we have this version of the US, of US history now, that is kind of trying to be taught, which is that like slavery wasn't that bad. The Civil War was a war about states' rights. States' rights to what? We're not going to talk about. The South was just like the good old boys. We need to go back to the 1950s when everything was calmer and families were like more, nuclear families with the nice housewife staying home. Like that was the good times. Like now is the bad times when everybody has to like work and families are broken and blah, blah, blah. Like that's what there has to be some appeal to this like mythical past in order to advance the project that you're trying to advance. And so you end up with this like culture that won't allow other alternative explanations for things or be willing to engage with that. I think we see it here, we see it everywhere. And so that seems pretty, I think that's like what's going on now. I will say that I think that those periods come and go. Like I'm an optimist in the sense that in the longer scale of time, this is going to be a blip. And in the future, we're going to get back to it because I don't think it's self-sustaining. And I think that it's not what Hinduism is meant to be. And in order to uphold that, like I think better times will come again in terms of this portrayal. I want to take this other question in the question and answer about women were given equal rights, because I hear this a lot. I think it's a really interesting point. So the comment says, women were given equal rights. You can choose your partner, Swayamvara of Sita, equal opportunity. Kaikeyi fought side by side with Dashrath. The Mahabharata was fought because morals were not upheld. Draupadi was objectified. Bhishma didn't raise his voice when his great-granddaughter was not respected. It's an interesting point, right? Because sure, choosing your partner, that was something that women were allowed to do within certain constraints. Kaikeyi was allowed to fight with Dashrath, and so were a few other women. Like there are, Satyabhama, other women in the stories did get to potentially fight. And you have disrespect of women being part of the cause of the Mahabharata. I think you can have all of these things and you can not have equal rights. That is potentially showing respect for women. It's showing more opportunities for women than people might have gotten in other cultures. That doesn't mean that the culture was therefore equal. It doesn't mean that women were, in general, allowed to speak in the public sphere. They were not allowed to run countries. They were not allowed to, be or inherit through that route. They were not, in general, trained to be able to do whatever they wanted. They could not hold religious positions of power for the most part. They could not perform religious rites. And their bodies were still used as objects of violence and disrespect. Like that was much more disrespectful to a woman than a man. And that is not equality, in my opinion. I think that there are progressive elements to Hinduism, especially compared to the other religions' treatment of women. We don't have a rule that says like women should not speak in the church. I don't think that's equality. And I think that even if you want to make the argument that the epics show some amount of equality, I believe that it matters how it's practiced. And historically and today, I don't think that this religion or any religion is practiced in a way where women are treated equally to men, where women and men have the same intellectual expectations, where their bodies are treated equally, where they are given the same types of choices and the same treatment. And I think that is what is kind of key for me on this topic.
Yeah, it's also about like who the systems are built for and
Right.
why they exist in the first place and who they're benefiting.
And I think, you can have something and be treated better and still not be treated equally. Like I think you think about women in America in the 1970s. They were treated better than they were at any other point in history. They also could not have credit cards without their husband's name on it, So like you can be treated better and you can have some rights that are great that the culture was giving it to them. That is not equality. And I personally don't want to settle for anything less than that.
Also, swayamvaras and things like that were a classist function. So your choice of marriage many of the times was only given if you were of a classist or casteist,
Yeah.
one and both.
And I mean, I think that's more to the point of like the fact that intercaste marriage did not happen.
Hmm.
And I think that also when we think about some amount of this, as is true in all societies, women of a lower class always worked, um, but they were treated much worse.
Hmm.
And they also had more freedom in marriages often, but the expectations on them to labor in the household were also higher. And again, this is not a Hinduism or India specific thing. That's just like a fact about human history.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the interesting questions that I see here, because we're approaching, we'll probably have time for like two more, I'm guessing, is have you found any pieces from regional or non-Vaishnavi translations that have stuck with you within either
Mm.
epic? Um, One of the ones that comes to mind for me, is the in the Ramayana, the version in which um Sita is Ravan's daughter, right?
Yes, I
That
was
as
about to say that.
yeah. I'm glad we're on the same page.
Because that's a version that I used for Kaikeyi, but
Yeah.
there are a lot of versions of the Ramayana out there in which Sita is Ravan's daughter, and but in some versions he knows, and in some versions he doesn't know, and he still kidnaps her for sexual reasons, which is in a way extra bad. Not that it was good to start with, but I think that's one that I find really interesting. One that I also found really interesting is I found a Jain version of the Ramayana in which Lakshman is the one to kill Ravan because Ram, as the hero, is not going to commit violence and end a life. And so it's Lakshman who actually takes that place, which I thought was fascinating and just goes to show how even the what in the mainstream version might seem like the most critical parts of the story can be modified and still be valid for a particular culture, time, experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there are so many like aspects of these stories that you see that feel integral to you, and then you have a conversation with someone and you're like, "Oh, this is not what you grew up with, or this is not what you learned."
So I want to get to other questions, so I'll make this really fast. But for Goddess of the River, I learned this because um, so when I heard the story of Ganga coming to Earth, which is in the first page, so like, this is not a spoiler, I hope. I always heard it as Ganga was coming to Earth and Shiva caught her like against her will. And so she was like kind of trapped onto the earth and Shiva did it as a good thing to protect people, but it was against her will. And that there was this almost antagonistic relationship between them at first. This is not like made up by me. This is the version of the story that I heard growing up. I got an early reader comment on Goddess of the River that was like, I can't believe you took such a beautiful relationship between Ganga and Shiva and you ruined it. And I was like, what do you mean? And they were like, well, when Ganga comes to Earth, she goes to Shiva and she says, can you help me come to Earth safely? And Shiva agreed with her. And it was an example of partnership and equality and people working together. And I was like, I've never heard this version like in my life. And so that was just, I thought that this was like the seminal story that everybody had heard, and I was completely wrong. And so it was just a shocking and interesting moment to me because it's like the thing that I thought was like so obvious was just a completely different story for them.
Yeah, and that's on how close people hold these
Yeah.
stories. Is there one last question that you want to answer or something that's sticking out to you?
Um, so I feel like I should answer a question about the writing process because we haven't talked about that and I know some folks are interested. So I see a question here about can you
Absolutely.
please speak about your revision process? And I was very fortunate with Kaikeyi and with Gods of the River to have a Hindu woman as my editor. And so she was also working from a framework of knowing these stories, believing in this religion, and having that kind of context for it. I think it would be very hard to revise these novels with an editor without that cultural context because it's like something you kind of have to grow up in and steep in. And so we did multiple rounds of revisions. The first round is always for like big picture edits. In both books, I added a lot of material to kind of build out the world and build out the early story of these characters. And it was very helpful to have her because she was like, what if we pull this strand or what if we pull this strand? And then I think a lot of revision passes were for kind of smoothing out the character arcs, which I think is like the second step, is that now you have the story, you have the beats, you have the character arc. How can you really make it like sort of shaped as an arc? And so working on that. And then there's always line edits and copy edits that kind of clean up your prose on the line level. I actually think line edits have some of the biggest impact because like they're the actual reading experience that people have. And aside from content, like you want a really smooth reading experience. So there's a lot of stages. I love revision. I write like terrible first drafts, kind of trusting that the revision process is going to get it where it needs to go. And so I do my best work in revisions, and I love to talk about that.
And I think we have enough time, and I want to end on a slightly lighter question. So, like, who are your favorite authors and favorite books or things that you've been reading maybe recently that you're very excited about?
Yeah, this is like the question at which point I like freeze and I'm like, have I ever read a book in my entire life? So what are some recent books that I have read? So one book that recently came out that I really enjoy because it's about West African mythology and history and is kind of different from the other myth retellings or those kinds of books is called Masquerade by Oo Shanguyomi. Um, I thought that was excellent, and would really recommend it. Um, I'm trying to think of like other. I really liked Shubnam Khan's The Jinn Waits 100 Years, which is about Indian migrants to South Africa and like a haunted house. So if you're looking for like other uh, culturally relevant books, I think that was interesting and just a really fun, kind of creepy haunted house story. Although I'm a wuss. What's another book? Another book that I read recently and really loved was Vanessa Chan's The Storm We Made, which is about uh, colonialism in Southeast Asia, which is very interesting and kind of close to home. So those are some recent recommendations. As soon as somebody asks me like, "What's your favorite book? What's your favorite author?" I like freeze frame. Never had a thought in my life, so I'm just gonna shout those out as like recent reads that I thought were really good.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It was so exciting to be able to finally chat and hear about like both of these books that are amazing. And I did want to let you talk like slightly, whatever you're comfortable sharing about your book that you're in development with or
Yes.
to release next year.
Yeah, so I have a book coming out next year in June 2025, and it's called 10 Incarnations of Rebellion. So, as the title might suggest, it involves Dashavtar, like that concept, very loosely. But what it really is an alternate history Indian independence story. Um, so it follows a young girl or a young woman living in colonized India and her journey to joining a resistance movement and the lives of people around her. In my opinion, it's my favorite thing that I've ever read, which I know is not like a stunning endorsement of the books that I have out, but I'm proud of them. This story is very close to my heart because it's inspired by generations of my family who fought for independence. And so it's coming next year, and I really cannot wait to share it.
I'm so excited to get my hands on it too. Um, but yeah, no, thank you so much for having this conversation. Um, I wanted to shout out Serena, who has been helping us, as well as David, who are amazing and have been doing a lot of the back end work for this current Zoom. And we have a few upcoming events and things happening next week. If you are interested, we have a fireside chat with um Anandanand Rambachan, and it's going to be about Hinduism and the origins of it. So it'll be a really exciting conversation to kind of continue some of these events. And I think the links and things like that will be in the chat. We have a local Annihilation of Caste book club that will be in the Bay Area. So if you're local to the Bay, feel free to join. And then we have a membership drive for HFHR that has been going on thus far. So if you would like to become a member and come to more of these very exciting events, and I swear the last link and the last plug is our incredible merch and also this incredible book, which I put the link of a um co-op bookstore based in DC. I think that is the last one that'll go into the chat.
And I'll pop in the chat my Instagram handle so you can
Oh
follow
yeah.
me for any updates about my next book and work. And I just like interacting with people on that platform. That's my preferred platform after Twitter has gone astray.
No, that's so fair. Yeah, so thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you, Vaishnavi, again
Yes,
for
thank you
all,
for having me and thank you for all the great questions.
and have a good evening, everyone.